I'm chairing this first session this morning. I'm Chris Mars. I'm the chair of the BSBI trustees. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Owen Mountford. Owen worked at CEH for 40 years, at Monkswood and latterly at Wallingford. His research focused on the impact of water management on wetlands and grasslands in the UK. He's also worked on biodiversity protection in Eastern Europe, especially Romania. And in fact, Owen joins us today from Bucharest. He has been studying Fenland for 50 years while working on the idea of a Fenland Flora. I think that's what you're going to be talking to us about today, Owen. So it's my pleasure to hand over to you.
Right. I've been sort of briefed to talk about botanical highlights of the Fens, but in many respects, what I'm talking about is a program of surveying for a flora, the Fenland Flora, which my colleague John Graham and I have been working on now intensively for 15 years or more, but which had its inception, as Chris has said, back in the late 1960s. The first question I want to ask today is, what are local floras really for? I've taken the example of Lincolnshire because it's a simpler one than most, with rather few published floras. A checklist followed by a full flora in the 1970s, and then a supplement. And it rather begs the question, is the flora meant to be a historical account looking back at what has happened in an area? Is it meant to be a snapshot in time describing the survey work of the author and his colleagues? And the Lincolnshire flora, simply because of its the rather few attempts at covering such a huge county, has always taken a synoptic, a sort of historical view, trying to take on board all the records ever collected for that county. I want to sort of think again for a moment as to what the model of the modern flora is, and others might suggest a better someone else as being the groundbreaker, but maybe because through Terry Wells I met John Doney, I would give him the credit of inventing the modern flora as we know it now. He asked questions, and we still do in floras. What species are present there in the county? What sorts of localities and habitats do they occur in? Where did they occur before the time of the flora? And if there's been change, when did it happen? Why did it happen? John and his contemporaries made sure that it was never simply a catalogue. He also addressed the ecology through habitat studies, his great innovation in that flora. And many floras since have taken on board plant communities as part of the focus of their attention. And floras have varied in the scope they take on. Most have always taken on flowering plants and pteridophytes, but then whether or not you take on bryophytes, stoneworts, other algae and lichens is a different question. We've been brave enough to try all of those. We'll see how successful we are. The scope as well, we've taken on board anything that's been found wild in Fenland, and that means well over 3,500 taxa. Looking at Fenland as a region, or as in natural England terms, a national character area, we overlap with several counties. Cambridgeshire has had the biggest record of floras going back to 1660, or right up to Alan Leslie's one of a couple of years ago. Huntingdonshire has had rather less treatment, but Terry Wells did a plant atlas flora just under 20 years ago now. Lincolnshire I've already talked about, suffering to some extent from its low population and size. Norfolk, often claiming to be the premier wildlife county, vies with Cambridgeshire in this case for coverage over the centuries. Northamptonshire we take on because we have the soak of Peterborough, and we got reasonable coverage there in the 20th century. And Suffolk, we've got 3 good floras to look back on for change in that part of Fens. So why write a Fenland flora? What are the special features of such an enterprise? What we were interested in was looking at a more natural unit, something that was defined by geology and soils, by climate, by landscape, by land use history and ecology, rather than and where we would be able to answer more subtle questions on what it was that caused changes in distribution, what the factors behind these were, natural or anthropogenic. I'm not big disparaging about the conventional county flora when I say the political boundary of a county often brings together a rather disparate set of elements in floristic terms. Now that can be its strength and its interest, but it means that our approach is it makes it easier to be holistic. And we have a model for this, if you like, or a precursor from 1979 from John Trist's Ecological Flora Breckland that we've taken I think a rather different approach, and people may be relieved to know we haven't used maps like John's. And we have focused, our other motive in doing this was to focus on an area that many had ignored in the past. This is by way of a contents page. The flora is about 40 to 50% written now. And for every single species account, there is a discussion of scientific names that have been used, vernacular names that have been, especially those that have been used in Fenland, what the variation is within the count, within the area. And we map distribution in three periods prior to 1970, the last 3 decades of that century, and from 2000 onwards. As is conventional, we've tried to find the earliest records in Fenland, and we've looked for evidence of species that are native or introduced in Britain, and also what their status is in Fenland, if that's distinct from their British distribution. The description then goes on to describe the distribution, the change and the ecology over the centuries, and to analyze that distribution. That's partly what I'm focusing on today. We've also looked at methods of reproduction, and we've looked at conservation, because in Fenland, this is absolutely crucial. There will also be contextual chapters. I'm going to skip over this at the moment because I'm not really presenting anything about that. But we have colleagues and friends who are preparing sections and accounts on all sorts of topics relating to Fenland, so that we can say that the flora is a benchmark from which future people can say, oh, this is what has happened in Fenland. The region has been hugely important for vegetation in the past. The primeval undrained Fenland had the most extensive area of lowland peatland in England. It comprised a mosaic of fen and bog and mire forest. It had some of the biggest lakes in lowland England. It had alluvial wetlands associated with the river estuaries, and it still has amongst the most extensive salt marshes in Britain. And as drainage began to affect the landscape, it developed new semi-natural habitats, lowland meadows, drainage channels, and relic fragments of fen that survived because of the products they gave to human beings. So this is my imagining of what Fenland might have been like, photographs taken by me in Estonia and in Siberia. But I think we have to argue that Fenland would have been a really rather special mosaic of wetland habitats, and possibly quite distinct from anything else in Europe. Many of us know, either at first hand or through reading about it, what happened to that natural Fenland, the impact of drainage from the Roman period onwards, using surface water channels, and then a technological change through higher and higher quality pumps, and ditches being replaced by under drainage of clay tiles and plastic piping, so that little by little natural habitats or semi-natural habitats were restricted or modified. What we did, thanks to my old colleague Mark Hill, someone very well known to many of you, was to analyze the distribution of species in Fenland and to use simply these distributional data to classify them into clusters with similar distributions. And quite a lot of what I'm going to say to you now is based upon this analysis. We can talk about a grouping of habitats, the few relic natural habitats that still survive, those created by the first phase of drainage associated with the drainage network and flood control, those that went back to the period of the first villages and reclamation, the hedges and the old winding lanes and old grassland on the Fenland Islands, and then the more modern habitats of the urban landscape or to do with transport routes. And finally in Fenland, the pervasive impact of arable land. Here are a couple of images which dramatize that. The Great East Fen and Deeps of northeast Lincolnshire Fens. And we see a map from 1661, and then one following the setting out of the enclosure and the drainage. And that area has lost almost all its fenland habitats now, or they're confined to small fragments. But it still has some of the best peat in Fenland. And it was the last area, many of you will know, that had plants of great interest like Tephroceras congesta, the fen fleawort. And change has continued into the current period. Here's a map of reclamation from near Terrington St Clement on the south side of the Wash. All I seek to convey from this is that we have bits of land, bits of modern day Fenland, which were salt marsh or mudflat as late as the 18th century, the mid 19th century, and in some cases, the latter part of the 20th century. A map of Fenland land cover, this produced by the Land Cover and Countryside Survey team at CEH, shows very much the pattern of habitats in Fenland, with the washes standing out starkly and a peppering of grassland, mostly improved in a sea of arable, and then several largish towns. Change has still happened in the 20th century, and you will see from that image how the arable acreage has increased, the grassland has decreased, woodland has spread through amenity planting, and orchards have had a catastrophic decline. So I'm going to choose a few habitats and look at a kind of retrospective classification of the species distribution. So to repeat, what each of these maps shows is the occurrence of a group of species with similar distributions in Fenland. Where there are grey dots, that does not mean they're missing, it means that there are relatively few of them present. The big brown dots are where most of them are present, and the intermediate brown dots are where a reasonable number are. These maps then show, but based simply on distributional data, there are no ecological information fed into it, but it does enable us to show how the extent of salt marsh habitat, its presence going up the tidal rivers, and its occurrence well inland. We have plants, for example, like Bulbochinus maritimus, the sea clubrush, well inland in Fenland, away from tidal influence. Another group that is of particular interest are those of natural true fen. And here, as you might expect, it is Wicken fen and Woodwalton fen, and to a lesser extent, Home and Baston fen, that come out as the hotspots. But notice also its presence over in the lower Nar, in the east side of Fenland, not just north of Downham Market, area there of some relic fen vegetation. We have a group that indicate peat woodland, often woodland dominated by birches and with a very rich bryophyte and pteridophyte flora, centered rather again on Home and Woodwalton, but along that eastern fringe of Fenland, from the Nar Valley northward towards Hunstanton, and then up in the northwest, in the peaty edges of the Witham Valley. There are several areas of birch and willow carr there, which have this rich peat woodland flora. One feature that dominates many of these distributions are the washlands. And the washland group itself, which includes species like the early March orchid you can see here, is accompanied by species that occur in other features of the washland, the drainage channels, for example. And you see how this assemblage of species is richest in the Ouse washes, pretty good in the Nene washes, and then follows the Glen and the Welland and a little bit the Witham in the north. And it's present in one form as well along the Cam and in the land associated with Wick and Fen. The main drains and rivers of Fenland are crucial habitats. And what limits the distribution of this assemblage of species is tidal control. So although there are big drains and big rivers going in closer to the wash, tidal water means that this group of species is limited to the middle and upper reaches. We then have a group of species which you could say are typical of ditches where farmers or internal drainage boards are active. And here we have a kind of two-feature distribution. Again, the washes with their conservation management come out, so does Wicken, but also the area along the west side of Fenland, where you have upwelling of calcareous water into shallow ditches that are cleaned regularly and which support plants like Grönlandia densa and Baldelia ranunculoides, the opposite leaf pondweed and the lesser water plantain in some of their best British populations. Another group of ditch species are found in less managed sites, where they're overgrown maybe with burreed and true reed, and also with reed canary grass and so on. And that group of species gets closer as a diverse and rich group to the edge of the salty influence, but still fades out there. Old grassland is a rarity in Fenland, but does occur. And it tends to be associated either with areas of floodplain grassland or around towns and villages like Soham and Ely, or it's along the major flood banks that were created in the early stages of flood protection. So that very notable area around Wisbeach, near the outfall of the Nene and its associated drains. There you see grassland of this quality, which is maybe not as rich as the North or South Downs, but is still fine old calcicolous grassland. Tree belts and hedges. People think of Fenland as an open landscape, and so it is. But there is a group of species which are very much associated with either the old presence of trees in hedges created in the early enclosures and early reclamation, or to do with protection against the wind, or simple amenity in recent years. And the distribution here is more difficult to interpret, but it does appear to follow the townlands, which is that belt of early reclamation from King's Lynn through Wisbeach and Holbeach and Spalding and Boston, and then up to Wainfleet. And it also, we see a treed landscape more towards the edge of Fenland in certain places. Trees, as I say, treed habitats have actually increased in Fenland in this last century. You will not be surprised that churchyards and the associated old walls are an important refuge in Fenland. And here the line of the townlands from Lynn, Wisbeach, Holbeach, and up to the north around the edge of the wash is much more obvious, picking out the original settlements, the medieval churches, and the species associated with either the walls or the old grasslands present within the yard. We see it as well as in islands at Ely and a little bit at Chatteris and March in the south. There is a matrix of common and ubiquitous species, those which occur on any old bit of wayside, plants like the false oatgrass, or those that are associated with tillage or disturbance. And we're trying to work out why that group thins out a little bit in South Lincolnshire, as that map suggests. We also have groups associated with urban habitats like broken tarmac, gravel gateways, or the engineering of the 19th century, old brick bridges, and old railway lines abandoned in the last 50 years. A group that particularly interests us is one that we have just a working title for. We call it broad-leaved arable. It's an assembly of rarer arable weeds, whose distribution you can see there, and which seems maybe to be associated with lighter soils, or possibly a calcareous influence from the chalk and the oolite, or possibly simply agricultural decisions to cultivate potatoes and sugar beet in those regions. But it's an interesting group that contains some of the rarer arable weeds. Verges are not uniform, just as I've said about ditches and drains. Not all verges are exactly the same. We have a group that are plants associated with those which are mown on a regular basis. And here, it's at least my contention that the blocks of this group, which you see in Norfolk and in the Lindsey part of North Lincolnshire, may be down to local district council management policy as much as anything, eliminating areas of coarse grassland and allowing species like the bird's foot trefoil or various bed straws to colonize and survive. The other group there is complementary to our old grassland group, and is a group of grassland species which are much more associated with old verges from the original reclamation or from flood banks along the earliest drains and rivers. Fenland does have hotspots. This is, as I said, we've got about 3,500 taxa recorded. We've been able to bring up through intensive recording, the number of tetrad records per unit to much higher than they were, but there are still areas which are outstanding and were known to be outstanding. The highest species numbers come from Wicken Fen and from around the town of Ely. There are then hotspots on the old Fenland Islands, associated with the settlements and the early grasslands there, and simply the diversity of landscape. There's another group of hotspots on the washlands and in the relic fens, and the river floodplains themselves also have a generally richer flora than does the open arable fenland. There is still a perceptible pattern between the silt nearer the wash and the peat inland, though there is also the complicating factor of the soils created by the early reclamation, the brown soils of the townlands. And we have this problem of the fenland edge, where so many of our records in the early days don't really state whether it was in Fenland or not. And so we have this artificially inflated richness around the margin, where what we call upland species, plants that grow at more than 5 meters altitude, I should say, are included in our mix, but really should be excluded. But there is the story so far. That's what we're writing on. We're attempting, if you like, to put Fenland on the map, to contribute to the county flora schemes in all the counties that overlap Fenland, and maybe to put a new view on what is the best way to approach an account of your local vegetation and your local wild plants. Thanks very much for listening. There are the credits for literally hundreds of people.
Owen, thank you very much indeed for that fantastic presentation of a great deal of fieldwork. I'm sure behind all that.
Huge amount, yeah.
Yeah, we have a small number of questions, but taking chair's privilege, I'm going to ask the first one, if that's okay, because you gave us a map about changes that happened in Fenland over a long period of time. I simply wanted to ask, is change still happening on Fenland land use? And is that in a positive or a negative direction in terms of biodiversity?
Both ways, I think, is the answer. The Fenland of the last 30 years, I gave a talk to the Cambridge Natural History Society a couple of days ago, and I quoted an English nature person from 1990 responding to my suggestion we do some work in Fenland, as that there was nothing of interest in Fenland except for the 2 or 3 national nature reserves, and it didn't need help, it didn't need research. There's been an awakening of interest in Fenland in the last 30 years by lots of people, and that tends to have led to very positive action, restoration and habitat creation schemes, and some species are therefore doing very well. But there is the counterbalance of urbanization, putting some grasslands and so on under tarmac, and the pervading effect of increased nutrient levels. A lot of our grasslands, a lot of the watercourses are influenced either by atmospheric deposition or by runoff from settlements and agriculture. And there we see a decline. Now, if you were to identify what is the most important what are the most important 2 or 3 habitats in Fenland, you would of course have, you would mention the salt marsh and you would mention the relic fen. Yeah. But you would then say the drainage channels. And where we have an aquatic flora that competes with that of anywhere in Britain or Ireland for its diversity. And many species do have their best populations in Fenland. But that is a threatened resource. And that map of Greenlandia is something that I would use for targeting conservation effort.
Okay, as an indicator of something that isn't going to tolerate too much more nutrient. Jim, do you want to find another question?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that fantastic talk, Owen. That was really interesting. Yes, again, can I put a question to you of my own? Give the audience some time to think of other questions. I was just wondering, is the data that you're collecting for the flora, have you gone out to do a survey, especially for the flora, or are you just tapping on the existing resources of data collected during Atlas 2020, for example?
I think we can claim to have made a contribution. Particularly John Graham, my colleague, and I have performed surveys in every single Fenland tetrad, which is about 2,500 of them. And that has all, from the very out, if you like, our first action on deciding we were going to do this flora was to speak with the relevant vice county recorders. And I don't think we're being arrogant by saying we came as something of a godsend to them, because it was somebody who was going to do the hard miles in what was perceived as they were very happy to be out there because that was their job in life, if you like. But not many other botanists were venturing into Fenland to record. So the Fenland Flora surveys are a key part of the overall database. But of course, each of the counties has had its own teams working, its vice county recorders here, and not just because he's going to speak later, an honourable mention for Jonathan Shanklin, who meant that John and I were able to devote ourselves more to the northern parts of Fenland because he was tetrad bashing through Cambridgeshire very effectively. And so it's a partnership. And I think what we can say we've done is made, well, from the the commissioned surveys done by ourselves. We have helped with the new atlas, with any new floras that come along, and helped make Fenland a less terra incognita.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to ask a quick question if I can. Valerie Heppel has asked, what does the name Deeping mean here in Fenland?
Deeping, oh, now in the name of I presume that's a question about the town of Deeping, or was she thinking about the Deeps, which were the area of the Great East Fen that I showed a map of?
Well,
if it's Deeping, I think
Deeping.
In that case, it does refer to, I think often means either something to do with the people of an area, Ingas, or it can mean something, or it can in some places refer to meadows associated with a watercourse. Mm-hmm. So whether the Deeping refers to peat depth or the fact that it was just a wet area, I suspect that it probably refers to the habitats and people associated with the River Welland at that point. Okay,
thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I've got a question from David Elston, who asks, the distributions of species groupings presented on tetrad maps, have the groupings been derived from analysis of data at tetrad level? Or has data been at a finer spatial scale, at NDC style quadrats, for example, been used?
We haven't used quadrats. I would now you'll forgive me if I dodge this one. I hope. I think that it was done all at a tetrad level. It was done by Mark Hill. It's a clustering program that he first demonstrated for Cambridgeshire some 10 years ago, applying to bryophyte and vascular plant data in the county. And I think it functions at the tetrad level as output, but what was fed into it were full grid references with a minimum of a tetrad resolution. So there aren't any as such, well, there are quadrat data in there, but they would be rendered as 10-figure grid references.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, shall I come in with another question? Jonathan Shanklin has asked, can you use the clustering to predict what the Fenland flora will be like in 400 years' time when sea level rise is likely to have inundated large areas of low-lying ground?
That's a good one. The prediction game. I think you would have to use those clusters. You would then have to feed in some biophysical data. You'd have to feed in soil information, proposed tidal impacts, elevation above sea level, you'd maybe have to put in spatial data that defines flood bank lines. Mm. I think they could contribute to a predictive model, but of themselves, no. It's what they are, is to reiterate, is a classification of plant distributions as they were in the first 20 years of this millennium.
Yeah, yeah. Related to the conditions that they currently.
And then what we've done is, and say no ecological data went in, so that we then retrospectively look at the groups of species, and we use information like PlantAt and our own ecological knowledge of these species and say, well, what are these groupings? What are they showing? So when we say that is an old flood bank group, we've done that by examining the data for the species in that group retrospectively, but the groups themselves just rely on the presence absence data.
Yeah, but Owen, you've applied your own observations to that. Therefore, okay, where are we finding these things?
Yeah.
Okay. Jim, I think there's time for one more question.
Okay. Michelin She Skeffington asks, have you seen much use of herbicide? And she was very impressed by the collection of adventives that you showed.
It's not so obvious in Fenland. I think you do see some impact on. I mean, the typical landscape we're talking about is a checkerboard of arable fields with grass banks and water courses forming the field boundaries. And you have a similar thing along the roads or the droves. So the impact of any herbicide is usually to do with the access point to the field or the arable crop itself. There doesn't seem to be quite the affection for large-scale use of herbicides on roadsides that I saw in Galway and Mayo.